Welcome to Our Next Existence by Katie and the Chorus. I'm Katie, former technology strategist turned reluctant spiritual medium, and I channel messages from the Chorus, a group of beings just beyond our sensory perceptions who are loving, expansive, and who greatly enjoy sharing their perspective of us. Join us each week as we share and discuss their ideas about humanity's existence, purpose, and future. Concepts you can draw from to accelerate your path, expand your perceptions, and ultimately step into the flow of the universe and your life. Welcome back, everybody. In this episode, I would like to jump in and give you guys a model for how to think about the soul, past lives, multiple dimensions or realities, and the game at large. So if you're just tuning in from like traffic, or you're at your job, or you're taking a break from something busy, I want to like state this up front because it's a little bit of a shift from like, oh, I thought I was just going to listen to a podcast, is jumping into like a little bit more of a technical explanation. So if you like technical explanations, this episode is right up your alley. And if you are accustomed to sort of like half listening to podcasts as you do other stuff, it still works here. Let the energy soak in, but you may want to come back and listen to this one again if there are specifics which come up in your mind later on as questions. Come back and listen again, and then it might work. So go ahead, continue with what you're doing, and I will jump in. Now, my goal with this episode is to sketch a drawing to accompany it. I'm not sure if I can pull that off, but I'm going to try. As many of you know from the first and second books, I draw diagrams and sketches of a lot of what I receive. And so I think this information will be well conveyed in a sketch, and I'm going to try and time it out with what I'm talking about. There's a good chance that some of this information or these drawings will make it into book 3. Which I also thought could be helpful because sometimes I think it helps integration-wise to hear a very human-paced discussion of something, in addition to the way it's very clearly described in sort of a written text like the books. So I'm going to make notes on my sketchpad as we go, and then I will try and record a video of me drawing this as I discuss it, and I'll post it to YouTube and Rumble. Okay, so let's jump in. First off, this is not the end-all and be-all model of how this works. As you guys know from listening to the Chorus and I, they are big fans of multiple perspectives and what can be drawn from those perspectives by you and your perspective. So this should be considered additive to anything you've found on your awakening path that already speaks to you. And so whatever from this model adds to that, run with it. And anything that doesn't add to your current standpoint on these things, just, don't worry about it. It's not like with the Chorus, you have to accept everything wholesale and like it has to become your new doctrine. It's kind of like the opposite of how they work. It's more like, here's more of a buffet and here's more of a buffet, and you can take whatever works for you. Okay, so let's start with you, the soul, as it is understood. The soul, by our perspective here in this timeline and this planet, is that it is sort of the essence of life that inhabits a physical format. Now, there's many, many discussions on souls and what else it could be, but let's keep it simple. And let's just say the soul is the thing inside of us that kind of animates this thing. Now, by the Chorus's view, the difference between soul and consciousness is that the consciousness is sort of the vaster us that is infinite. And the soul is actually an expression of ourselves here in these frequencies. They have suggested, or we have suggested in previous episodes, that by view of some other civilizations, the soul is actually quite physical to them. Our definition of physicality sort of begins and ends with the physical body, because that is classically what we have been able to see on the wavelengths of visible light. So we sort of are like, the body is physical and the soul is sort of ethereal, and that's a fine perspective. But in some other civilizations, they operate so much at the soul level that is actually the more tangible aspect of the avatar that is used in sort of the game broadly or across all of these physical dimensions. The soul is really what moves around and is the storage bank of information. The physical body, as we understand it, is kind of more considered a day-to-day costume. Okay, so your soul inhabits a physical format here in this day and time. And I'll just say in 21st century Earth, as it is understood. And I just had to look up which century it is because I never remember. I don't know if you're like that. Like, wait, which is the 20? It's like 2020, but it's the 21st century. Anyways, okay. So here we have our costume, which we would call the physical body that is inhabiting or is acting in this timeline, 21st century Earth. So one of the first questions that people then have is, okay, where do my past lives fit in this diagram? Which is a great question. Now, according to our linear version of history, we would draw a line out behind us that our soul has inhabited one after the other. So first I was in ancient Egypt, and then I was here, and then I was a colonist, and then I was whatever. So it's a one at a time sort of fashion of understanding things. As we talked about in the second book on time, that is a perfect perspective, which the Course does not take issue with. There are many civilizations in the galaxies that use linearity to understand time and different aspects of it. However, if we were to take an additional way of looking at time, we might look at it as more simultaneous. This is the hub and spoke model, which is illustrated in the second book, in which the present moment is the hub and the spokes are all these different experiences of different lifetimes, which are actually happening at the same time. So let's go ahead and use that version of time in this model, and it'll start to make sense in a minute as to why. So here's the soul, and I am actually going to sort of draw lines from the soul to these other simultaneous realities or dimensions or timelines or whatever your preferred word is for where the soul goes in experiencing these other versions of what we would call physicality. So if you notice, some of the things that I'm drawing are not actually humanoid because depending on what your soul wanted to experience or was set out to experience next, it may be a variety of what we might call the costumes. So the physical expression. Now, understanding that we put on these costumes in these different timelines is one way to look at it. But remember, the Course considers these a unified field of expression between the resonance of those energies, the resultant beliefs and thinking that occurs, and the physical expression. So really, another way to look at it is that your soul moves into these slightly different frequencies across the game board. As a result, resonates slightly differently and looks blue or tall or blob-like or you name it. Now, the images I am drawing are not because I'm familiar with all of these costumes. I'm just sort of sketching different ideas on what these things could look like. Okay, so if we are not progressing through these costumes, through these physical expressions one at a time, then how is it working? Great question. So as we have started to discuss this season with distance, the soul moves around rapidly, far more rapidly than our conscious perspective in this avatar, this 21st century Earth, had been able to mentally contemplate, which was the goal of the establishment of this experience of limitation and the resonance with these frequencies, is that we would be narrowed. And therefore, these frequencies of the five senses did not have capacity to recognize and track the movement of the soul at that velocity. It was too quick, basically. This is also true of some of the frequencies in these other avatars, on these other threads. You could consider, now it's an infinite universe, so you draw the lines where you want, but you could consider the current avatar that I am broadcasting from the slowest avatar, meaning the resonance here or the perception of resonance here is the most limited. And in some of these other formats, they oscillate or are able to perceive oscillations of energy much more easily. We would say they have more access to frequencies than what the five senses does. And they might say they oscillate more rapidly and can perceive a higher vibration, might be one term for it, being, which makes humanity's awakening all the more extraordinary. Because if you look across the sea of things that the soul is able to move between, and some people consider that number to be very, very high, the current avatar that you and I are sitting in listening to this podcast is ostensibly the most limited one. Okay, so back to the speed. So you are bouncing around as a soul, into all of these different avatars. Your soul is the storage bank. It remembers, or it is energetically connected to, remember by the Course's definition of memory, it is energetically connected to all these things. Obviously, look at the diagram, like the soul is the one moving into all of these things. It's still happening. So as the soul moves around, the soul maintains this database of all of these movements. What is happening as we are awakening is that we are sort of expanding closer and closer and closer to sort of a unified perspective with our soul itself, which is sometimes called the higher self. Now, I'm not a particular fan of that term because it immediately, for humans, for five senses humans, instigates our beliefs in hierarchy, which are vast and ancient and pervasive and tend to be limiting. So rather than maybe putting it all on a ladder, although I know I have done so here in the diagram, let's consider that this is all sort of on an even playing field. And the soul sort of moves around laterally through all of these different dimensions, realities, and lifetimes. We are expanding in a way that is actually, from a certain perspective, starting to encompass more of the avatars beside us, if you wanted to think about it as a flat diagram. So you could easily say, oh, we're expanding upward and we're rejoining our soul. And that's a fine perspective. But you could also say we are expanding outward as the soul inhabits this avatar. I mean, here I am conscious right now having this conversation with you and my microphone. So the soul is active in me. And I am conscious here in my soul and my expression within this costume. So as my soul is here, I am expanding outward from this avatar and starting to reach or reconnect with or remember, whatever your preferred word is, my other experiences across the game board. This is what is happening with the AO, as we've been talking about in recent episodes. And this is what's happening for many people as they start to have very vivid and very clear memories of other things that they seem to know or have done or have experienced in a slightly different setting than what they know here in 21st century Earth. So you could easily say, oh my gosh, I just remembered that I worked on a space station. Or, oh my gosh, I just remembered I was a farmer out in this field and there was all these crops that don't even look like they're from this millennia. And what is happening is that you are reconnecting through the expansion of your soul to those things that your soul is potentially simultaneously still experiencing or has done so. Again, this is why humanity's awakening is so extraordinary, because from the most limited avatar, from the most limited costume, we are now able to somehow reconnect with and integrate these other more vaster, is that a word? These other more expanded avatars that we have been. Remember what we were just saying about how other versions of us and other resonances are able to perceive faster oscillations and a greater variety of energy? So, from our most limited, can't see any kind of energy kind of position, we are now reconnecting to much more dynamic and capable resonances or aspects of us, which to the greater audience out there in the energies is sort of like, how are they doing it? As we talked about a few episodes ago, this is the fascination with humanity. So we signed ourselves up for one of the most extraordinary experiences of limitation in all the galaxies. We had next to no contrast or connection to the direct power of the creative universe. And yet somehow, here we go, we're expanding. All right, so now we're going to take it up a notch. That was a really good, baseline explanation of a model of looking at this that really we just laid down in order to put something on top of. So here goes. Okay, so my question is, where does the AO sit in this diagram? Now, you could easily say, well, Katie, I think the AO might be this super tall character next to your little avatar. It's another version of us from another timeline. And that would be a valid thing to say. And in fact, in the earliest days of channeling the AO, I thought so too. I thought I had simply touched into a different aspect of our history. And that is a way of looking at it. An additional way of looking at it is that the AO, and I just drew wings to express the AO. I'm not sure why I did that, but we're going to roll with it. Not sure what kind of claim I just made by drawing those little lines, but I know better than to question it. I'm just going to let that be. Okay, so you could look at it in another way as the AO is on a slightly different frequency than the frequencies across which the soul is currently moving. So I'm going to draw a box. And, it's an infinite universe, so boxes, whatever. I'm just trying to illustrate a point. So I'm going to draw a box around our soul and all these avatars that we've been bouncing around in between. And outside of that box is the AO. The AO sees our souls, sees our hearts, might be a way that they might say it. Now, we can have lots of interesting conversations about the difference between a soul and a heart in our perspective. But remember, from the AO's perspective, the heart is the energetic system of what we are. They see our energies broadly, which we would consider a soul. It's the energy of us that moves around. So the AO is looking across a distance, basically. Now, you can make this distance as big or as small as you want to make it, as fat or as difficult to cross as you would like. But they are not oscillating between all these different frequencies and avatars in the way that we are by their perspective. They are outside the box, looking at all of us inside the box. They see our souls, and they see essentially what they would say by their view is the series of illusions that we are all participating in, which we would call our different lifetimes, dimensions, or realities. Why would the AO not consider these lifetimes to be quote unquote real by their perspective? It's a true resonance, right? If my soul resonates over to frequency A in this box and then frequency Z in this box, and A is when I was a gladiator and Z is when I was a businesswoman or I was blue on another planet, okay, then these are real experiences that I feel like I am having because I am resonant on those frequencies. And as we defined in season 1, what's real is basically just a perception of energy. So those things are real to us because we are resonating across these things. It is not real to the AO because they see it as a subset of what our soul is experiencing. It is simply an expression of where our soul is moving around to. It's no more complicated than saying you're standing on Smith Street, but we still see you standing on Smith Street. And we say, but I had a whole life on Smith Street. I had a house and I had this and I had that, and I knew how to do these things. And they're saying, sure, that was your experience on Smith Street, but we still see you expressing yourself on Smith Street. So I'm just going to label one of our avatars Smith Street. And there you are, a blob on Smith Street. It was a great time. So by the AO's view, they are, you could say, seeing the substance of what we are across all of these frequencies. They don't get distracted by a particular costume. So they don't identify as strongly with any single of these subsets of us more strongly than the way they identify us at a soul level. Now, to us within the box, we might struggle with that at first as we're awakening, because we are awakening from the perspective of the 21st century earthling that we are. And so we are coming out of and through a perspective of identifying with this particular frequency. We're still learning more about our soul, and we're definitely still learning and remembering more of these other experiences that we've had on these other frequencies. So it's a little bit of a gap. It's a little bit of a challenge at the moment to take in an AO perspective, which feels vast and feels like they see through to our hearts. And we recognize that, but we're also still sort of coming to terms with the vastness of what we are across these things that we're just starting to remember. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, and this doesn't have to be complicated this first go. We can do more of these. And also my diagram now that I'm doodling is not that complicated. So if you've just been listening to this whole time, it's probably okay. But I'll still post this pretty terrible stick figure sketch. Okay, so but before we go, I want to ask one more question. I want to add one more layer, because this is important for where we are all heading in the immediate future. We have questions about the soul. Here's a model of how to look at the soul that could help with that. But my next question is, where is death in this diagram? Is the AO on the other side of death? Is our soul on the other side of death? Is death only a characteristic of 21st century Earth's avatars and costumes? Where do you think it could be? As usual, there are many ways to look at it, but I will give you a version which I think could help us all as we approach sort of these next steps. We have talked a lot about the veil of death being an agreement of sorts. In fact, that was in the diagrams, the illustrations at the back of the second book. And in fact, I'm just going to flip to it in my copy so that I can be specific. So by the Chorus's view, the creation of death was created as a result of the third cataclysm. So remember, the third Earth civilization was still relatively godlike. We were still floating on tops of mountains and absorbing energy in different ways. And we just really didn't know limitation the way we know it today, and particularly not in this physical format, in this costume. The cataclysm at that era was what the Chorus would call a quote-unquote war of the gods. It was vast, pervasive, and immensely destructive. They said that this has also been called the War of the Titans. And I'm going to read directly the next few paragraphs because I think it would help. So this is on page 221 in book 2. By this time, your physical formats had evolved or devolved beyond pure eyesight. You would recognize aspects of the physical formats you hold today, though you were then immensely more powerful, fluid, and indestructible. Thus, the war raged on for some time. Capitulation achieved, one side emerged victorious. And what did you find in your wake? Destruction and loss. A new kind of loss, which you called death. A barrier a boundary that once crossed was becoming more and more difficult to cross again. But that was not the only connection that was breaking. As the dust settled, you realized that the mountains had been flattened, the passageways to the higher realms were lost. Only then did you recognize that the ancient ability to connect to the consciousness of the mountains had faded away. You were no longer able to reach the etheric realms. So there's a bleak sort of summary of our fall from grace. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. But then that created the dawn of the fourth Earth civilization, which is our predecessor. We are in the fifth Earth today, according to the Course. And so you can look in the book and see how they describe the fourth Earth civilization and the fourth cataclysm. But for today's purposes, we are talking about the barrier of death. Now, they describe it as a barrier or a boundary that once crossed was getting more difficult to cross again, which means at some point we could. If you consider the frequencies of living life just frequencies and the frequencies of death just frequencies, it sounds to me like we were able to pass between these different frequencies just like any old frequencies in the universe. But at some point, a sort of barrier or delineation between those frequencies and these frequencies started to be constructed or recognized, or basically our ability to resonate across any frequencies that we chose was being constricted. Isn't it interesting the way they describe it is that we were so caught up in this war of the Titans and the war of the gods. We were so busy being pissed off at each other and fighting each other that we didn't even realize that this had happened until the dust had settled. Basically, we were all sort of yelling and smashing each other, and we finally turn around and we realize that the mountains are destroyed. We've forgotten how to connect to their consciousness and grow them again. Water flooded the plains as a result of this cataclysm as well, which they mention in the book. And that our ability to connect to the higher realms had been lost. So perhaps one way of looking at those frequencies of death is that they are in a quote unquote higher realm. Now, again, I use that word softly because it tends to instigate within us beliefs of hierarchy, which are often, but not always, disempowering. And so I don't want any of this to sense disempowering. It's more of a description of the delta as opposed to the difficulty to cross it. Now, I know death has been traditionally difficult for us to cross and come back again, but as we know, it's not impossible. We have many examples now of people having experiences where they feel that they have died, gone over to those frequencies, and come back again. Now, what they recall from that passage is often heavily influenced by the beliefs of the five senses when they return. But there are aspects which persist. A general sense of it's vaster, more shit's possible there. I liked it better. Why am I back here? Not always, but often. And that would be a true and real perception. Because if you have, in a way, migrated into your soul's perspective, and in your soul's perspective, vibrated across that barrier into those other frequencies, it's gonna feel a lot more full of possibility and freedom than the very, very dense, very narrowed, very limited five senses humanoid format that we know and love in this reality. Okay, so back to our diagram. One way of looking at the barrier of death could be this little line between us and the AO. That perhaps the AO is representative of frequencies that did exist and do still exist, that had more to do with that third Earth, and potentially the fourth Earth too, that basically they stayed on that side of the barrier of death. And we came in somehow on this side of the barrier of death. And so they are still of or resonant with those etheric realm frequencies. Now, why then would I have heard them at ancient sites in our world? Or why would I hear them when I go to beautiful places out in nature, again, in our world? Have I shifted into a different frequency when I go to those places? Potentially. Or potentially I'm still here, foot in the game, but I am expanding outward and I can hear them more clearly in that expansive, open, allowing portal of beauty kind of space. As we talked about in the episode on the energetic house, and also by the chorus's view in this progression of cataclysms, there was a time when you could look at these worlds as potentially one and the same. If the world, as we would understand it, back then, was one that encompassed all of these frequencies without a veil of death, we could just move around and see everybody and go everywhere we pleased. It could be looked at as when there was a veil of death instigated, we are all still in this same world, but there are some parts of it that we can perceive and some parts of it that we can't. We're all here together, but some of us are very blind and have forgotten everything practically. So when we travel to these ancient sites, and when we begin to feel our hearts expand or reconnect with our souls, as we would understand that word better, reconnect with our souls in that vaster level, we are actually spanning the difference, spanning the delta between the frequencies of the five senses and the frequencies of the rest of the world as we at one point knew it and are therefore able to perceive things with our five senses that we might not have been able to before. Meaning, as we've talked about, you walk up to an ancient site, maybe even one that you've been to a dozen times before, and you say, holy shit, I never noticed that giant megalithic block. Oh my gosh, I am seeing this artwork for the first time ever. What the heck? There must have been a landslide between when we were here last time and this time, and look at this cave, and it's full of interesting things. That is actually a five senses translated expression of your expansion into other frequencies. So, another way of looking at the veil of death is that we each wear one. We are each, from the five senses perspective, walking around with a veil on us. One that darkens and obscures our heart's ability to connect to these other frequencies, these other family members and loved ones that we once knew, that in some ways they are still able to see the entirety of that world that we once knew and us, asleep or infected or captured, whatever word you prefer to use, that we are constricted in some way into this narrowed perspective. And we say, under the veil, here we are in the living world, and whereon our loved ones depart, off they go to death. And they are saying, we are alive and vibrant, and you are finally waking up to the veil that had been put across your hearts and disconnected you from perceiving all of us, the vaster universe, and the divine realms as we knew it. You could say that we are collectively bringing down the barrier of death. You could also say that we are each individually bringing down the veils that we have each worn in this experience. Whatever way you slice it, one thing is true: we are expanding. For any and all who choose to. Collectively, as a tribe, as a people, as an awakening class of extraordinary humans, we are finding our pathways home again. And at each step, we will be reminded through the illusions of this reality, through magical numbers that show up at just the right time, through songs that play on the radio that seem to say so much more at just the right moment, through indications from nature, animals, and magical beings themselves, that we are loved and have been loved the entire time that we have all been under a blindfold by those who could see us still, who missed us, and who waited with great anticipation for our victorious return. We love you infinitely. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you found these messages to be helpful. May they accelerate you on your path wherever you'd like it to go. For more information on the books which correspond to these podcast seasons, our podcast, live events, or how to get in touch with us, visit katieandthechorus.com. Thanks again. See you next time.